Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in the history of Appalachian Virginia. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where these documented accounts come from and what times of day or night they arrive. In the fall of 1867, the remote hollows of Grayson County, Virginia were very quiet. It was like a held breath pressing against the mountain ridges. 2 years had passed since the war ended, and the mountainous area was even more cut off than before. Cut off not only by geography, but also by the shared trauma that hung over every settlement like fog that wouldn't go away. Many young men had not come back from far-off battlefields, and those who had seemed forever changed, with shadows in their eyes that no amount of mountain sunshine could get rid of. In this setting of shared sadness and unspoken pain, the case of the Harwick brothers would happen, leaving a mark on the community's memory that lasts to this day. A darkness that would spread through local stories and be passed down as quiet warnings through the years. The mountains themselves seemed to be a part of the isolation that would be so important to what happened next. Grayson County was in a very remote part of southwestern Virginia where the Blue Ridge Mountains made it hard to get around, even when the weather was nice. The county seat, Independence, could only be reached from nearby settlements by narrow, winding roads that were blocked by heavy rain or snow in the winter. Because of this geographic isolation, people lived in close-knit communities where everyone knew what their neighbors were up to. It was also a great place for people who wanted to do things without being seen. Morai and Zephaniah Harwick owned a small farm about 8 miles northeast of the town center. The only way to get there was by a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned, through thick groups of oak, pine, and mountain laurel that were very dangerous. The property they got from their father, Josiah Harwick, who died of consumption in 1863, included a 2-story log cabin built in the traditional Appalachian style, a small barn made of rough-hewn timber, and about 40 acres of land that was only good for farming after 3 generations of hard work. Local property records that were kept in the basement of the county courthouse and found during a thorough. The brothers, who were 34 and 31 years old at the time of the cataloging project in 1954, had never been married. A situation that made some of the more gossipy people in Grayson County talk about it from time to time, though these talks were usually short and quiet and only happened behind closed doors. The Harwick family had settled in the area in the 1820s when Josiah's father, Ebenezer Harwick, followed the mountain trails west from North Carolina in search of cheap land. The freedom that came from being far away from established power. Ebenezer was a man of few words, but a lot of willpower. He cleared his first plot with just an axe, a plow, and an iron will that his children would pass down in different forms. He married Martha Kellum, a local woman whose family was one of the first to settle in the area. Together, they built the foundation for what would become the Harwick Holding. The brothers were known for being good at their jobs, members of the community were somewhat reclusive during the 1850s and early 1860s. When business needed to talk to people in the town, Morai the Elder acted as the de facto spokesman. This was a role he naturally took on after their father's death. People who lived at the time wrote about him in diaries and letters, saying he was tall and thin, with hair that had turned gray before he turned 30 and eyes that were pale blue, like the sky in winter. Some people found his eyes so intense that they made them uncomfortable during long conversations. He was always polite, but there was something about him that made him seem distant, as if he was always thinking about something else, something that others couldn't see. Zephaniah was shorter and wider than his brother. He didn't talk much in public, instead standing a little behind Morday with his hands behind his back and nodding when it was appropriate. He didn't add much to conversations, where Morai planned out. Zephaniah gave off a kind of watchful silence that some neighbors found comforting and others found a little creepy. His eyes, which were darker than his brother's, seemed to record everything with mechanical accuracy, keeping track of who talked to whom, who walked with confidence, and who looked weak or alone. They grew a small amount of corn, beans, and squash on their farm, along with a small herd of goats that gave them milk and sometimes meat, and a few chickens that laid eggs, and dinners on Sundays. The brothers also planted a small apple orchard that gave them enough fruit for their own needs, and a little extra that they could sell or trade. One or both of the brothers would go into town every few months to trade extra food for things like salt, sugar, bullets, and cloth. These transactions went smoothly and without any unnecessary small talk, but merchants always said the brothers were honest in their business dealings, trying to shortchange or lie about their goods. They paid their bills on time, went to church services at the primitive Baptist church that met in a simple wooden building on the outskirts of Independence, and helped their neighbors during the harvest season when asked. Because of this last trait, they were respected in the community because mountain tradition said that farmers should help each other during important times. But those who worked. People who worked with the brothers on these community projects later said that their helpfulness was strange. They seemed especially interested in learning about their neighbors' personal lives, asking questions about family issues, health problems, and getting ready for winter that went beyond small talk. Silas Brennan, who farmed land next to the Harwick brothers and often worked with them, would later tell investigators that Morai was very interested in which neighbors lived alone, which families had relatives who lived far away, and which older people had trouble with the physical demands of living in the mountains. Brennan thought these questions were just friendly, neighborly concern at the time, but looking back, he saw that they were part of a pattern of gathering information for more sinister purposes. The last time anyone saw both brothers together was on November 21st, 1867, when they went to Cornelius Pike's general store to get supplies for what Morai called a small Thanksgiving get-together. Pike's detailed ledger, which is kept in the County Historical Society archives and carefully written in his distinctive copper plate handwriting, shows that the brothers bought an unusual amount of preserving salt, several yards of cheesecloth, a variety of spices, including a lot of sage and thyme, and a lot of rope that Pike thought was strange for the time of year. Pike's personal journal was found decades later during the settlement of. His estate has a more detailed and personal account of this deal that shows how the merchants were starting to worry about the brothers' behavior. The Harwick boys seemed different today. They had an energy that I hadn't seen before. Zephaniah seemed unusually lively, almost excited. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by a kind of barely contained excitement. He looked at things with a strange amount of focus, feeling the texture of cloth and the weight of things with his hands to check their quality. Tools, as if I was judging them for reasons I couldn't understand. Morai, on the other hand, kept his usual calm demeanor, but there was something underneath that I couldn't quite put my finger on, a tension in his posture that made it seem like he was carefully controlling his excitement. The journal goes on to say, when I asked Morai about their Thanksgiving plans, he simply said they were expecting a lot of guests and wanted to make sure they had enough food. The way he spoke seemed formal and rehearsed, as if he had thought about this explanation ahead of time. The strangest thing was that Zephaniah wanted to check every piece of rope I had in stock by pulling it taut between his hands with a lot of force. When I asked him what he needed, he just smiled, the first time I had seen him show any warmth, and said they needed something that would hold securely for a long time. The phrase stuck in my mind because of the way he said it, as if the words meant something to him. Pike also noticed that the brothers paid for their purchases with an unusual amount of cash, including several gold coins that seemed inconsistent with the modest income their farm would have generated. When he commented on their apparent prosperity, Morai explained that they had recently sold some livestock to a traveling buyer, though Pike could not recall seeing any such buyer in the area, and the brothers' goat herd appeared unchanged during his occasional visits to their property. November 24th marked the traditional Thanksgiving in Grayson County, but the holiday's excitement had faded in the years after the war. Because the war had ruined the economy, most families celebrated quietly, thankful for their survival rather than their abundance. They acknowledged their blessings with quiet reverence instead of the loud celebrations of earlier decades. The weather that day was unusually mild for late November, with temperatures reaching almost 60 degrees and clear skies that offered unobstructed views of the surrounding mountain peaks, their summits touched with the first snow of the season. According to subsequent investigation records filed with the county sheriff's office, several residents later reported seeing unusual activity in the direction of the Harwick property on Thanksgiving Day. Observations that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later acquire ominous meaning. Jeremiah Blackstone, whose own farm lay approximately 2 miles distant across a narrow valley, stated that he observed. There was a lot of smoke coming from the area around noon, much more than what would normally come from cooking. The smoke seemed to come from more than one place, which meant that there were probably several fires going at once. It lasted for several hours instead of the short time that meal preparation usually takes. When asked if he thought about looking into it, Blackstone said that the Harwick brothers were known for being private and that he thought they were just smoking meat for the winter. He said that the amount of smoke seemed too much for those activities, and the wind sometimes carried an odor that seemed different from regular wood smoke, but he couldn't say what made it different. Similarly, Adelaide Crenshaw, the wife of a local minister and a woman known for being very observant of community affairs, said that she heard what she called excessive shouting, coming from the general direction of the Harwick farm during the afternoon hours. The sounds carried clearly across the mountain air, which was unusually still that day, creating conditions where voices could travel considerable distances. She initially attributed the vocalizations to celebration, noting that some families became quite boisterous during holiday gatherings, particularly if alcohol was involved, though she remarked that the quality of the sound seemed somehow different from typical merrymaking. Mrs. Crenshaw's account, which she gave to investigators several weeks later, includes details that she was hesitant to share at first. The shouting was upsetting to me, but I can't say exactly why. It seemed to rise and fall in ways that suggested distress rather than celebration, and there were times when there was complete silence for several minutes before it started again. At one point, I clearly heard what sounded like pleading, though. I couldn't hear specific words because I was too far away. I told my husband about my worries, but he reminded me that the Harwick brothers had the right to do things their own way and that we shouldn't guess what was going on their property. It was only later that she thought that the sounds might have meant something other than Marant, and she would always remember that she didn't look into it more at the time. As the investigation went on, more witnesses came forward, each adding small pieces to a puzzle that would eventually show how horrible it was. Ezra Holbrook, who ran a small grist mill on a creek that ran near the Harwick property, said he saw strange things happening around the brothers' barn on Thanksgiving Day evening. He used his spyglass, which he used to look at distant fields, to see both brothers moving between the barn and the house, carrying what looked like heavy bundles. The bundles seemed to require considerable effort to transport, with both men working together to manage their cargo, suggesting significant weight or awkward dimensions. Holbrook noted that the brothers seemed to be working with unusual urgency, frequently pausing to look around as if concerned about potential observers, though their property's isolated location made discovery unlikely. Most peculiar was the fact that they continued their activities well into the night, working by lantern light when most farming activities would normally cease. The miller observed lights moving around the property until nearly midnight, long after any legitimate agricultural work would have concluded. The first indication that something might be seriously amiss came 3 days later when Ezekiel Morrison, a neighbor who occasionally assisted the brothers with heavy labor in exchange for small amounts of cash or produce, arrived at the Harwick property to collect payment for recent work. Morrison had helped. The brother had promised to pay Morrison for fixing parts of the fence the week before. When Morrison went to the farmhouse on the day he was supposed to, he found it empty and no one answered his calls or knocks on the front door. Morrison's first look around the property revealed several worrying details that would later turn out to be important to the investigation. The animals looked neglected, with goats bleeding near the barn and chickens scattered around the yard, showing that they hadn't been taken care of in a while. The water troughs were almost empty, and the hay had not been spread out, which suggested that they had been left alone for at least 2 days. The most worrying thing was that there was no sign of any human activity or response, even though there was clear evidence that people had been there recently. Morrison grew more worried about the brothers' safety and circled the property, looking through windows. He saw that the inside looked undisturbed, but strangely. The building was empty of personal items that should have been there. The brothers' work clothes were missing from hooks where they usually hung them, and there were no signs of recent meal preparation in the kitchen. Most importantly, he could smell something coming from the building that he described to the police as smelling like meat that had been left too long near heat, even though it was a cool day and there was no clear source for the smell. The smell was strongest near the root cellar entrance, which Morrison would later emphasize when giving testimony to investigators. He also pointed out that the barn doors were slightly ajar, even though the brothers usually made sure their property was secure. He also noticed wheel ruts in the soft earth near the front of the house, which meant that a wagon had recently been parked there, even though the brothers' own wagon was nowhere to be seen. Morrison wasn't sure if it was right to go into another man's home without permission, so he left and told Sheriff Tobias about his worries. Sheriff Whitmore made a decision that would be very important to the investigation that followed. His detailed observations formed the basis for the official inquiry that would eventually reveal the full extent of the brothers' activities. Sheriff Whitmore was a veteran of both the Mexican War and the more recent conflict between the states, and he approached the investigation with the methodical thoroughness he had developed over years of dealing with the various crimes and disputes common to frontier communities. When he got to the harm on November 28th, he was with Deputy Marshal Caleb Thornton and Dr. Benjamin Radford, who was the county's unofficial medical examiner. He quickly noticed several things that Morrison had missed or not mentioned in his first report. For example, there were fresh wheel ruts in the soft earth near the front of the house, which showed that a wagon had recently been parked there. However, a closer look showed that the tracks were from a heavily loaded vehicle with deeper impressions than. The tracks led away from the property toward a little used mountain trail that eventually connected with the roads leading to adjacent counties. This suggests that the person who made the tracks made a conscious choice to avoid main roads where other travelers might see the wagon. Whitmore also found several items scattered in the yard that seemed unimportant on their own, but created a pattern of hasty departure when looked at together. These included a dropped button from a coat, pieces of torn fabric caught on fence posts, and stains on the ground near the barn that looked like they were organic but had been partially covered with fresh earth. The sheriff's first look inside the farmhouse showed a scene that looked normal but felt very wrong, like it had been carefully set up rather than left behind. The furniture was in its proper places, the dishes were clean and stored properly in the kitchen cupboards, and the brothers' few personal belongings were still there. The beds were made with military precision. The clothes were folded and put away in drawers with unusual care, and even the fireplace had been swept clean of ashes. However, closer examination revealed troubling anomalies that suggested the appearance of normalcy was intentionally created to disguise more sinister activities. Several chairs were positioned in the center of the main room, facing each other in a configuration that served no obvious domestic purpose, and rope fibers. The beds were made with military precision, and the clothes were folded and put away in drawers with unusual care. The fireplace was even swept clean of ashes, but when they looked more closely, they saw strange things that made it seem like the normal appearance was meant to hide more sinister activities. For example, several chairs were set up in the middle of the main room, facing each other in a way that didn't seem to serve any domestic purpose, and rope fibers clung to their wooden surfaces, showing that restraints had been put on and then taken off. The floorboards had dark stains on them that had been scrubbed with a lot of effort, but they were still faintly visible under close inspection, especially where blood had seeped into the wood grain and resisted complete removal. Even more disturbing were the changes that had been made to the inside of the house. The brothers had hidden these changes behind normal furniture, but they became clear during the iron hooks had been put into the walls of the main room at heights and intervals that could not have served any legitimate domestic purpose, but were perfect for holding restraints. The hooks had been painted to match the wood around them, making them almost invisible to the naked eye, but scratches and wear marks around their bases showed that they had been used often. The most disturbing thing was what was found in the root cellar, which could be reached through a narrow door next to the kitchen that opened onto. A steep wooden staircase led down into the ground beneath the house. The underground room, which was usually used to store preserved foods during the winter, had been completely emptied of its usual contents and changed for reasons that were hard to explain. Instead of shelves full of canned vegetables and cured meat, Whitmore found signs of recent activity that made it look like the room had been turned into something like a dungeon. More rope remnants were tied to iron hooks that were stuck in the stone walls, placed at intervals that would allow multiple people to be restrained at once. The hooks looked like they had just been put there, as the mortar around them showed fresh tool marks where they had been installed. There were also dark stains on the dirt floor that made patterns that looked like bleeding had happened multiple times, and the earth had been disturbed and repackaged several times in an apparent attempt to hide evidence. The cellar also had a collection of personal items that clearly belonged to people other than the Harwick brothers, things that seemed to have been taken from victims as trophies, or simply thrown away after their owners no longer needed them. Among these were a woman's knitted shawl of fine quality, still bearing traces of expensive perfume that suggested its owner had been a person of some means, and a man's gold pocket watch engraved with the initials R.T. and the date 1841, which indicated it had been a significant gift or inheritance. Several pieces of things that clearly belonged to people other than the Harwick brothers, things that looked like they had been taken from victims as trophies or thrown away when their owners no longer needed them. These included a woman's knitted shawl of fine quality, which still smelled like expensive perfume, suggesting that the owner had money, a man's gold pocket watch with the initials R.T. and the date 1841 on it, which suggested that it had been a big gift or inheritance. Jewelry, including a unique silver locket with a jurra, a type of elderly woman, inside it. Her face showed the refined features of the educated class. The most disturbing items were pieces of clothing that looked like they had been cut away instead of taken off normally, which meant that the clothes had been taken off of their wearers in a way that made it impossible for them to do so. The clothing showed signs of violence, with tears and stains that suggested struggle, and several pieces had what looked like knife cuts on them. Sheriff Whitmore carefully listed each item in his official report, even though he thought at first that these things might belong to the brothers' mysterious Thanksgiving guests and could be returned once the family members were found. It wasn't until later that the full meaning of the discovery became clear, as the investigation showed that many of these items belonged to people who had been missing from the community for weeks or months, the most unsettling. In the barn, Whitmore found evidence of what could only be called extensive butchering activities that were far beyond what a typical farm family would need. A large wooden table, which was poorly built but strong enough to hold a lot of weight, had knife marks and stains that were consistent with meat processing. But the patterns of cuts and the amount of staining suggested activity that was much more intense than normal livestock slaughter. Numerous sharp tools hung from pegs along the walls, including several knives of unusual size and shape that didn't seem right for farm work. These included filleting knives that were better for fish than livestock, bone saws like those used by professional butchers, and cleavers that were heavy enough to split large bones with one blow. Most of the tools showed signs of recent heavy use, with blade edges worn from frequent sharpening and handles stained with substances that had gotten into the wood. Most troubling were the remains found in a corner of the building, carefully hidden under a pile of old hay, was found when the sheriff's systematic search disturbed the covering. The fragments looked like bones from large mammals, but Whitmore's report carefully avoids saying for sure what they were, only saying that they looked like they belonged to creatures the same size as adult humans. The bone showed clear signs of butchering, with saw marks and knife cuts that showed systematic dismemberment done by someone with a lot of skill, several large. There were barrels near the back wall of the barn that held a brining solution. When looked at, the solution showed more bone fragments and what looked like pieces of flesh in different stages of preservation. The way the solution was made was similar to how pork is usually preserved, but the scale of the operation was much bigger than what would be needed for a typical family's winter meat supply. Dr. Radford, who looked at the barrel's contents, said in his private report that the preservation process seemed to have been going on for a long time, and there was evidence that multiple batches were being processed. When what looked like human remains were found, the investigation went from a simple missing persons case to one of the most horrible criminal investigations in the history of the area. Sheriff Whitmore quickly stepped up his efforts, asking for help from nearby counties and starting the long process of trying to identify possible victims from the limited evidence available. As word of the discovery spread through the community, additional information began to emerge from residents who had previously remained silent about concerning observations or interactions with the Harwick brothers. The Reverend Matthias Crenshaw came forward to report that several members of his congregation had failed to appear for recent services without providing explanation or sending word about their absence, an unusual occurrence in a close-knit community where regular church attendance was considered both a religious obligation and a social necessity. Among the missing were Robert Tinsley, a widowed blacksmith whose initials matched the pocket watch found in the cellar, and Priscilla Hawthorne, an elderly woman who lived alone in a small cabin approximately 5 miles from the Harwick farm and whose absence had been noted, but not yet investigated, by concerned neighbors. Additional missing persons included Jeremiah Watts, a traveling preacher who had been expected at several communities but had failed to arrive. Martha Kellum, an elderly widow who had recently inherited a large sum of money from her late husband, and Nathaniel Brooks, a peddler who had regularly traveled through the area but had not been seen for several weeks. More troubling testimonies came from travelers who had passed through the area in recent weeks and had direct contact with the Harwick brothers. A peddler named Josiah Barnett, who had returned safely from his travels and was located through inquiries in neighboring counties, reported that he had visited. Barnett went to the Harwick farm on November 20th to sell his goods, as he did every year during his seasonal rounds through the mountain communities. His story gave disturbing details about the brothers' behavior in the days leading up to their disappearance. He said that he was invited to stay for dinner and spend the night in the brothers' barn, which was common for traveling merchants who needed a place to stay while they were on the road. However, he noted that during dinner, the brothers had asked him a lot of questions about his travel plans, like who was expecting him at certain places and how often he talked to family members who lived far away. Their questions seemed too detailed and persistent for casual conversation. They seemed too interested in my personal life, Barnett told investigators during a formal interview in the county seat. Morai wanted to know if I had relatives who might worry if I didn't show up on time. Schedule, how many people knew my planned route, and whether I kept in touch with business partners who might notice if my letters stopped coming. Zephaniah kept asking about my route through the mountains and whether other people might use the same roads in the winter. At the time, I thought they were just making small talk, maybe thinking about starting their own trading business and wanting to know how it worked. But their questions seemed strangely specific and persistent. Sparnett continued, "During supper, they seemed particularly interested in learning about other merchants who traveled alone, elderly people I might encounter who lived in isolation, and whether I had observed anyone in the area who appeared vulnerable or in need of assistance. When I mentioned that I sometimes encountered individuals who seemed lonely or struggling with the challenges of mountain life, both brothers became quite attentive, asking for specific details about these peoples, circumstances, and locations. The peddler also said that he had to leave the Harwick farm sooner than he had planned because he was feeling uneasy, but he couldn't explain why. I left early the next morning, saying I had important business in the next county, but I really just wanted to get away from them. The way they looked at me when they thought I wasn't paying attention made me anxious to leave. I had the strong feeling that they were judging me for reasons I couldn't understand. Understood, and I was relieved when I got to the main road and could continue my journey. Nehemiah Bridges, an itinerant preacher who often held services in remote mountain communities where established churches were not available, told a similar story. He arrived at the Harwick farm on November 19th, seeking permission to water his horse and rest briefly before continuing to his next destination. The brothers not only granted his request but insisted he stay for dinner and evening prayers, showing a level of hospitality that seemed excessive given their reputation for privacy. During the meal, they questioned him extensively about his ministry, his travel schedule, and whether church authorities tracked his movements between communities. Their inquiries seemed designed to determine how much oversight existed for his activities and whether his absence from scheduled appointments might be quickly noticed. They also showed intense interest in learning about the people They were very hospitable, even though they were known for being private. During the meal, they asked him a lot of questions about his ministry, his travel plans, and whether church authorities kept track of his movements between communities. It seemed like they were trying to find out how much oversight there was for his activities and whether he would be missed quickly if he missed a scheduled appointment. They were also very interested in learning about the people he encountered during his travels, particularly those who lived in isolation or had minimal contact with the broader community. I found their hospitality somewhat overwhelming, Bridges testified in a written statement provided to investigators. They seemed eager to learn details about my ministry that had little bearing on casual conversation. Zephaniah particularly wanted to know about people I might encounter who lived alone or had few social connections. When I mentioned visiting isolated widows and elderly residents who rarely attended regular services due to distance or infirmity, both brothers became quite attentive. Morai suggested that such people might benefit from his and his brother's assistance, particularly during harsh winter months when basic necessities could become scarce. Bridges noted that the brothers seemed particularly interested in learning the locations of isolated homesteads and the names of people who might welcome visits from helpful neighbors. At the time, he interpreted their questions as evidence of real Christian charity and gave a lot of information about a few people he thought would benefit from community support. Only later would he realize that he had unknowingly given the brothers a list of possible victims. These testimonies, along with the physical evidence found at the farm, started to paint a scary picture of what the brothers were doing before they disappeared. Sheriff Whitmore's investigation showed that at least 8 people had disappeared from the area in the months leading up to Thanksgiving. All of them were elderly or lived alone, had few family ties, and few people who would notice right away that they were gone. Sheriff Whitmore's investigation method showed both the limited resources available to rural law enforcement and the comprehensive approach needed for the crimes. He worked with a small team that included Deputy Marshal Thornton, Dr. Radford, and sometimes help from volunteers from the community. The sheriff carefully wrote down evidence, talked to witnesses, and tried to figure out where missing people had gone in the area. The case got even more complicated when they found a detailed journal kept by Maury for several years, hidden under a loose floorboard in the main room of the house. The journal was black leather and had almost 200 pages of entries. Written in a precise hand, initially documented routine farming activities, weather patterns, and occasional visits from neighbors. However, beginning in early 1867, the tone and content shifted markedly, revealing the development of the brothers' criminal enterprise. Entries from spring of that year referenced new opportunities and expanded provisions for winter storage in language that seemed innocuous when read casually, but acquired sinister meaning when considered alongside the physical evidence found at the farm. By summer, Maury was keeping a record of visits from people he called potential contributors to our welfare. He wrote about meeting different people in the area in a way that made it clear he was carefully considering their personal situations, weaknesses, and isolation. The journal entries never directly mention illegal activities, but they use coded language that would protect them if the authorities found the document. However, the cumulative effect of the detailed observations about people's habits, the schedules and possible weaknesses give the impression of systematic predatory behavior over a long period of time. One entry from October that stands out as particularly disturbing says, Z has developed considerable skill with the preservation process. His carefulness and methodical way of doing things make me think we can keep a good supply going through the tough months ahead. The most recent guest thanked us for our hospitality, but they didn't seem to know how much work we had put into getting ready. We need to keep being careful about who we choose, making sure that absences won't draw unwanted attention from the police or nosy neighbors. Another entry from late October gives us more information about how the brother chose his friends. This week, I looked at 3 possible candidates. The older woman who lives close to Copper Creek seems perfect. Little family ties, rare contact with neighbors, and a lot of physical distance that would make it harder to find them. The traveling merchant might help us. Purposes, but his set route makes things risky if people notice he's gone quickly. The farmer, who is a widow, has chances, but because his land is close to more populated areas, he needs to think carefully about when and how to get rid of it. The journal also shows that the brothers knew about the risks that came with what they were doing and tried to limit their exposure by planning and carrying out their plans carefully. Maury writes a lot about how important it is for them to keep their community's good name and how they need to change. Their methods to avoid creating patterns that are easy to spot, and the importance of going after victims whose disappearances could be explained by natural causes or voluntary departure. An entry from early November shows how smart they are about picking their victims. To be successful, you need to be patient and do a lot of research. There are many things to consider when judging each candidate: level of isolation, social ties, routines that are easy to predict, physical abilities, and chance of resistance. Decisions made in a hurry make risks and problems that aren't necessary and could put our long-term safety at risk. Zed agrees that our current method, even though it takes longer, is the best way to keep things running smoothly in the long run. The investigation grew to include searches of nearby properties and in-depth interviews with people living in Grayson County and nearby areas. Sheriff Whitmore's methodical approach included making detailed maps that showed where missing people were last seen and where they were last seen, the Harwick brothers, and possible places where evidence could be found. This geographic study showed patterns that weren't clear when looking at each incident on its own. Several families said that the Harwick brothers had come to see them in the past few months, always pretending to be helping their neighbors or making social calls to bring the community closer together. In each case, the brothers were very interested in the residents' daily lives, social lives, and preparations for winter. Information that would later be very important in choosing their victims. They often helped with heavy work or maintenance projects, which gave them a chance to see how families worked and figure out which people might be most likely to feel alone. The brothers seemed to be picking on people when they were most vulnerable. Recent widows who are having trouble keeping up with property maintenance tasks that are too hard for them to do. Older people whose adult children had moved away were looking for more chances. People who travel through the area but don't have much to do with the people who live there. The brothers were always polite and helpful, which made it almost impossible to figure out what they were really up to until the investigation showed how much more they were doing. Lucinda Hartwell, an old widow who lived alone near the county line, gave testimony that showed how the brother was able to manipulate people in a very clever way. She said that Morai had come to her property at the end of September, helping her fix her roof, which had been damaged in a storm not long ago. She needed help because she didn't have the money or strength to hire a professional. He was very polite and seemed to care about my well-being, Mrs. Hartwell said in her testimony. He asked me a lot of questions about my daily life, like if I had family who visited often, and how I dealt with the problems of living alone. At that point, he seemed to be interested. It seemed like he was just being a good neighbor, but now I see that he was trying to find out how weak and alone I was. He also wanted to know about my neighbors, how often we saw each other, and if anyone checked on me regularly. He seemed especially interested when I told him that my closest neighbor lived more than a mile away, and that I often went days without seeing anyone else. Before he left, he told me that he and his brother often helped older people, Mrs. Hartwell said. During the winter, he offered to help with things like hauling firewood and taking care of animals. He said he would come back in a few weeks to check on how I was doing with my winter preparations. I was grateful for his offer and looked forward to his return, never suspecting that his apparent kindness hid such evil plans. The only thing that saved me from whatever fate he had planned was that I decided to spend the winter with my daughter in Tennessee. Other potential victims gave similar testimonies saying they had unknowingly escaped the brothers' predatory activities through coincidental changes in their circumstances or last-minute decisions to alter their routines. These accounts revealed the brothers' methodical approach to identifying and cultivating relationships with vulnerable community members, establishing trust, and gathering intelligence that would facilitate future attacks. The search for additional evidence led investigators to discover a network of caves and abandoned mine shafts throughout the mountainous terrain. The brothers had apparently found and prepared natural hiding places around the Harwick farm for various uses related to their criminal activities. Several of these places showed signs of human habitation, such as makeshift shelters made from salvaged materials and food storage areas, which suggested that the brothers had been preparing hiding places for a long time. The caves also served as disposal sites for evidence that couldn't be safely destroyed or hidden on the brothers' property. Investigators found pieces of clothing, personal items, and human remains in different stages of decay all over the cave system. The way the evidence was spread out suggested that the brothers had used multiple locations to lower the risk of being found and had created a systematic way to get rid of bodies that took advantage of the area's complicated geology. The most disturbing discoveries were in the deepest caves, where investigators found more human remains in different stages of decay. stages of decomposition along with evidence suggesting that some victims might have been kept alive for extended periods before being killed. Makeshift restraints constructed from rope and iron hardware indicated that the caves had been used as temporary prisons, allowing the brothers to control their victims until they were ready to complete their crimes. Dr. Edmund Thorne, a physician from the county seat who assisted with examination of the evidence, provided a clinical assessment that carefully avoided explicit conclusions while writing his findings in a way that would be allowed in court. His report says that the remains showed signs of being deliberately changed in a way that was consistent with food preparation methods, but he didn't directly say that the bones belonged to people who had been killed by the brothers. Dr. Thorne's medical knowledge was very important in figuring out the full extent of the brothers' crimes and how they did them. His examination showed that the victims were killed in ways that made them less likely to fight back and kept the meat from spoiling. The cuts were very precise, and the way the bodies were cut up in a systematic way suggested a lot of planning and experience, which means the brothers had been perfecting their methods for a long time. The careful language of official reports from this time shows how shocking the discoveries were, and how the community didn't want to fully admit what had happened within. The investigation also revealed that the Harwick brothers had been gradually liquidating their legitimate assets over the course of 1867, selling livestock and surplus property to various buyers throughout the region in transactions carefully structured to avoid attracting attention. These sales, the brothers were able to get enough money through a series of small exchanges with different buyers to disappear for good if they needed to. They also had cash on hand to buy supplies for their illegal activities. Evidence suggests they had been planning their departure for months, possibly because they thought their activities would eventually draw attention, or that it would become harder to choose victims as people became more aware of them, the systematic nature of. Their preparations showed a level of criminal sophistication that was unusual for the time and place. Financial records found during the investigation showed that the brothers had built up a large cash reserve through their various transactions, much more than their legitimate farming activities could have generated. Investigators were able to trace the belongings found on their property to specific missing persons, many of whom were known to have valuable items or a lot of money. Robert Tinsley, the missing blacksmith, had recently inherited a lot of money from his dead brother, and was known to keep gold coins hidden in his workshop. Priscilla Hawthorne, the missing elderly woman, was the widow of a successful merchant, and was thought to have jewelry and cash that she kept at home instead of trusting banks that were far away. Other missing people had also been targeted for similar reasons: their vulnerability and their known or suspected wealth. A major breakthrough in figuring out what happened to the brother came when investigators found out that a wagon that looked like the Harwick vehicle had been seen traveling through nearby counties in the days after Thanksgiving, carrying what looked like a heavy load and only traveling at night. Multiple witnesses in Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina said they saw two men driving a heavily loaded. They traveled by wagon along mountain roads, always avoiding busy areas and refusing to talk to other travelers. The last confirmed sighting was near the Virginia-Tennessee border, where a toll keeper at a remote mountain pass noted the passage of a wagon that matched the description on November 27th. The toll keeper said that the two men seemed nervous and quickly paid their fee without talking to each other, which is what long-distance travelers usually do. He also said that their wagon looked heavily loaded and eager to cross into Tennessee before dawn. This sighting suggested that the brothers had successfully fled to places where they would be unknown and could potentially start new lives, especially if they had enough money to buy property and fit in with new communities. The Appalachian Mountains' difficult terrain and sparse population offered many chances for people to disappear, especially if they had the brothers had learned how to survive and how to get around the mountains where they grew up. Local authorities worked with sheriff's offices in nearby states to look for the fugitive brothers, but the difficult terrain and sparse population of the mountain regions made it very hard to find them. The brothers knew a lot about remote trails and hidden valleys that would let them stay hidden for a long time, and their careful planning showed that they had found a way to avoid detection. Potential destinations and escape routes well in advance of their departure. More troubling was the possibility that they might attempt to continue their predatory activities in new locations, where potential victims would be unaware of their history, and local authorities would have no reason to suspect their presence. The brothers demonstrated ability to integrate into communities while maintaining their criminal activities, suggested they could successfully establish themselves in new areas and resume their predatory. The community's reaction to the news about the Harwick brothers showed how shocked and disgusted people are when they find out about crimes like these in close-knit communities where trust and helping each other are important. Many people couldn't believe that people they had known and interacted with for years could be responsible for such terrible crimes, and they had a hard time reconciling their own experiences with the horrible evidence that investigators found. The brothers. Their actions were even more horrifying because they were known for being helpful and polite. This made people in the community question their assumptions about the people they thought they knew and how reliable their judgments of character were. The fact that such evil could exist behind masks of respectability and kindness shattered the community's sense of security and replaced it with suspicion and weariness that would last for decades. Reverend Crenshaw gave a series of sermons about the theological implications of the case, struggling to provide spiritual guidance to a congregation grappling with the realization that evil could exist in their midst without detection. His notes, preserved in church records and discovered during a comprehensive cataloging project in the 1920s, reveal the difficulty of reconciling Christian teachings about human nature with the evidence of the brothers' systematic predation on their own community. How do we maintain faith in human goodness? The Reverend wrote in his private journal, "When faced with such premeditated evil committed by individuals we welcomed into our homes and entrusted with our well-being. The brothers went to our services, took part in our community events, and acted like they were good Christians, but at the same time, they did things that were completely against our moral teachings. This case makes us think about the possibility that evil can take forms that our normal human instincts can't see." The community's sense of safety had been completely destroyed, and it was replaced by distrust and fatigue that affected every part of social life. Neighbors who had been happy to help in the past were now more cautious about doing so, wondering if their kindness could be used by predators. Residents were afraid that travelers who looked like they needed help might be criminals trying to find out who they were. So the tradition of welcoming strangers was greatly reduced. Possible victims. The case had a huge psychological effect on the whole region, not just the local community. It changed how police do their jobs and how communities keep themselves safe. Sheriff's departments in nearby counties started working together better to share information about missing people and suspicious activities. They realized that criminals could easily cross county lines to avoid being caught. The official end of the investigation came in the spring of 1868 when Sheriff Whitmore decided that all available resources had been used up without finding the fugitive brothers. His last report said that the remains of at least 11 people had been found, but he also said that other victims may have been completely disposed of in ways that left no evidence that could be found. The careful way he wrote his conclusion showed how terrible the crimes were and how limited 19th-century investigative methods were. The case was moved to the federal level. Because the brothers' flight crossed state lines, it was a matter for federal authorities. However, during the post-war period, federal law enforcement was very limited in remote mountain areas. Most of the resources that were available were used to rebuild and keep the peace, not to catch criminals on the run, especially those who were working in areas where the federal government wasn't very present and local cooperation was uncertain. There were no confirmed sightings of Morai or Zephaniah Harwick for years, but there were occasional. Police in the area kept getting reports of strange people in remote mountain communities. Authorities in Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina were still worried that the brothers might still be alive and active, even though most of these leads turned out to be cases of mistaken identity or unrelated criminal activities. The official investigation came to an end with the conclusion of the investigation, but the case continued to have an impact on law. Attitudes toward law enforcement and how they work in the Appalachian region. The brothers' ability to operate undetected for a long time while still being respected in their community showed that jurisdictions need to talk to each other more and come up with better ways to spot predatory behavior. The Harwick farm was finally sold at auction to pay off debts and taxes, but it stayed empty for many years because it was linked to the crimes. People in the area stayed away, and stories about the site became part of the community's oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation as a warning about the dangers of trusting appearances and the evil that could be hiding behind friendly faces. Because visitors associated the buildings with the terrible things that happened there, they were left to fall apart over time because of neglect and intentional vandalism. The house was no longer safe to live in by the 1880s. The barn had partially fallen down, leaving only the foundations and scattered debris to mark the spot where these horrible crimes had taken place. Around 25 years after the brother went missing, a remarkable discovery was made in 1892 when an abandoned cabin in a remote part of the North Carolina mountains near the Tennessee border was torn down. People who were hired to clear the land for new construction found a secret compartment under the cabin's floorboards that held personal papers belonging to Morai Harwick, with journal entries going back to 1871. These writings suggested that the brothers had successfully avoided being found for several years after leaving Virginia. They started a new life in a remote mountain community where no one knew their past, and their apparent respectability helped them fit in with the people there. The journal entries from this later time give us troubling insights into Morai's state of mind during their exile and the problems they had keeping their fake names while keeping their criminal urges in check. The later journal entries show how hard it is for Morai to live with fake identities while feeling urges that Morai calls both unavoidable and necessary for their mental health. He talks about how they are always torn between keeping up their public image and meeting their deep-seated need for control and violence, which is what drove them to commit crimes in Virginia. The discipline needed to keep Morai wrote in an entry from June 1869 that the current situation puts a lot of psychological stress on people, which is getting harder to deal with. Zed has a hard time with the restraint that our situation requires. Sometimes he gets so angry that he doesn't care about our safety. We have done well in this new community, but the things that protect us, like the need to look respectable and helpful, also stop us from doing things. That would give us the satisfaction we need. The journal goes on to say, "We have found a few possible candidates in our new community who would work for us, but the small size of the local population means that any disappearances would be quickly noticed and investigated. In Virginia, we had years to build our reputation and find isolated victims, but we need to be very careful not to draw attention to ourselves that could lead to our true identities being discovered." Mordai's matter-of-fact talk about their plans for future activities is the most chilling. He says that the isolation of mountain communities still gives them chances like the ones they used to have, but they need to be even more careful because of their situation and the higher chance of being found. Zed has suggested that they might need to think about moving again to a bigger community where disappearances might not be as obvious right away. The entries also. The brothers knew that if they did something illegal in Virginia, it could come back to haunt them if they got caught doing something else. This made it even harder for them to keep their cover while also making it harder for them to meet the psychological needs that had led them to crime in the first place. An entry from early 1870 shows how they were debating how to handle risk. Zed says that our current restraint is unsustainable, and we must either accept the risks of resuming our activities or abandon them entirely. I maintain that patience remains our best strategy, but acknowledge that indefinite suppression of our nature may prove impossible. We have discussed the possibility of targeting travelers passing through our area. Individuals whose disappearances might be attributed to natural hazards or decisions to change their routes. Such victims would provide the satisfaction we require while minimizing the risk of creating. Local authorities have started asking questions about travelers who have passed through our area without permission. The last entries in the recovered journal, which were written in late 1871, suggest that the brothers were planning to move again, possibly because they were getting too much attention from local authorities, or because people in the community were suspicious of their behavior. Morai writes about recent problems that have made their current situation impossible and the need to find better conditions for continuing our work, reaching their intended destinations. Morai noted in one of his last entries, "While we have not been directly implicated, the pattern of inquiry suggests growing awareness that something unusual may be occurring in our vicinity. Z believes we have attracted suspicion through our excessive interest in learning about strangers passing through the area, though I maintain that our questions appeared to reflect normal community concern for travelers' safety." The journal ends abruptly with an entry expressing their decision to leave. Immediately, we leave tonight. Zed has gotten our supplies ready and found a way for us to get to our next destination without being seen. It's too bad that we have to leave our current situation because we had set up a good cover identity, but recent events have left us with no choice. We need to be more careful about where we choose our next location so that we can do our work safely while still doing what we need to do. There has never been any more evidence in the Harwick case. Historians and law enforcement have tried to track the brothers' movements after 1871, but they have not been able to find them. Researchers studying historical criminal cases are still not sure if they continued their predatory activities in new places, but the passage of time has made it less likely that they will ever find out for sure. The Harwick case raises important questions about community responsibility for identifying and responding to predatory behavior within their midst. The brothers' success in maintaining their facade of respectability while conducting systematic crimes over an extended period raises disturbing questions about the reliability of social intuition and the danger of trusting appearances in the absence of concrete evidence about individuals' true character. Their ability to identify and exploit vulnerable individuals within their own community demonstrates how predators can use intimate knowledge of local conditions, social dynamics, and individual circumstances to their advantage. The systematic nature of their approach, combined with their careful attention to victim selection and risk management, reveals a level of criminal sophistication that challenges assumptions about rural criminal activity during the 19th century. The community's response to discovering the true nature of the Harwick brothers also provides insights into how societies cope with the revelation that trusted members are capable of extreme evil. The initial disbelief, followed by revision of previous interactions and reassessment of character judgments, reflects psychological patterns that have been observed in similar cases throughout history. The long-term impact on community trust and social cohesion demonstrates how such crimes can affect far more people than their immediate victims. The case also illustrates the limitations of 19th century law enforcement when confronted with sophisticated criminal activity that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The brothers' successful escape shows how determined criminals could use the communication and coordination problems of the time to avoid being caught and possibly continue their activities in new places. As time went on and the community's memory of the Harwick case faded, the story became part of the larger tapestry of Appalachian folklore and criminal legend. New generations learned about the brothers through second-hand accounts that mixed fact with speculation and embellishment gradually, turning the historical record into cautionary tales that focused on universal themes of betrayed trust and hidden evil. The main parts of the story, like the trusted neighbors who turn out to be monsters, the systematic predation on vulnerable community members, and the successful escape from justice, are all fears that people have about hidden evil and betrayed trust that go beyond specific historical events. These themes have come up many times in Appalachian folklore, showing how the region is still worried about isolation, vulnerability, and the potential for evil to exist behind facades of respectability. Modern visitors to Grayson County can still find local residents who claim family connections to the original investigation or knowledge of previously undisclosed details about the case. These accounts vary widely in their specifics and reliability, reflecting the natural evolution of oral tradition over more than a century and a half. However, they demonstrate the enduring impact of the Harwick case on local consciousness and its continued relevance as a source of community memory and identity. The question of what ultimately happened to Morai and Zephaniah Harwick remains unanswered and likely will never be resolved definitively. They may have continued their predatory activities in new locations, gradually refining their methods and expanding their victim count over subsequent decades before eventually dying of natural causes or accidents while living under assumed identities. Alternatively, they might have been caught and punished by vigilante justice in some remote community where their true nature was eventually discovered. The possibility also exists that they gradually abandoned their criminal activities due to advancing age, increased law enforcement awareness, or psychological changes that reduce their compulsive need for violence and control. However, the psychological profile suggested by their documented behavior makes such voluntary cessation seem unlikely, as their crimes appear to fulfill deep-seated needs that would not have been easily suppressed through willpower alone. What remains certain is that the Harwick brothers succeeded in their immediate goal of escaping justice for their documented crimes, leaving behind a community forever changed by the knowledge of what they had done and the realization that such evil could exist undetected in their midst. Their victims, whose names and stories were largely lost in the official focus on the perpetrators rather than those they harmed, represent the human cost of predatory behavior that takes advantage of trust and weakness for the worst reasons. The case serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most normal appearances, and that communities need to be on the lookout for people who would take advantage of their isolation or circumstances. The brothers' methodical approach to finding and hurting people with few social connections shows how important it is to keep an eye on community members who might be at risk, and make sure that no one stays so isolated that their disappearance might go unnoticed. In the end, the disturbing legacy of the Harwick brothers lies not only in the specific crimes they committed, but in the questions their case raises about the nature of evil and the fragility of social trust. Their story continues to serve as a dark chapter in Appalachian history, a reminder of how predators can operate successfully within communities that view them as respected neighbors and helpful citizens. The fact that they risk and making sure that no one is so alone that their disappearance goes unnoticed. The Harwick brothers' case raises questions about the nature of evil and how fragile social trust is. Their story is still a dark chapter in Appalachian history, a reminder of how predators can work in communities that see them as good neighbors and helpful citizens. Their legacy is even more disturbing because they were never brought to justice. This leaves open the possibility that their story went on long after they left Grayson County, in places and with people who never learned to be wary of two brothers offering help with ready smiles. The autumn winds still blow through the mountains of Virginia, carrying whispers of old stories and half-remembered warnings. In quiet moments when the mountain communities settle into evening stillness, some residents still listen carefully to the sounds coming from outside their doors, remind them that not everyone who offers help has good intentions. In fact, the most dangerous predators are often the ones who seem the most helpful, trustworthy, and eager to meet their neighbors' needs.